Thank you for listening to The History of the Papacy, an Agora Podcast Network member. We are on Facebook and Twitter, and you can find both by searching for A2Z History Page. You can also send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or show ideas, I'd love to hear them. I especially would like to hear your questions about church music and church art. Keep sending in those great questions for the upcoming questions, answer, and comments episode. I love your comments, too. Comments are great, and they give me a lot of fodder to discuss different things. So send in questions, comments, anything you like. Well, I'd love to hear them, especially if you record a little piece of audio and send it to me of your question. That would be awesome, too. I'd also like to hear your comments about the episodes that have been featured on Nick Barksdale's Study of Antiquity in the Middle Ages YouTube channel. Nick just does a masterful job of combining the audio content of the history of the papacy with great visual content. Definitely go to his channel, click the subscribe button, and ring the bell to get updates. He also features content from many other creators who you will enjoy as well. I'd also like to let you know today that the History of the Papacy is now on the Himalaya podcast platform. Himalaya operates much in the same way as Patreon, where you can become a monthly paid subscriber. You will receive many great benefits. On top of that, the Himalaya Android and Apple Podcatcher app is really one of the best I've used out there. It's really easy to use, and I think you'll even switch to that if you checked it out. You can just search for the History of the Papacy podcast at Himalaya.com or follow the link in the show notes. Now today we are going to take a quick look at the popes right after the papacy of Gregory the Great. We recall the papacy of Gregory the Great is generally marked as the point where the city of Rome and the Roman Church hit their low point in all of the important areas of power a great power needs. Finance, politics, influence, culture, and really any other metric you can think of. Gregory began the process of reversing the backward slide of Rome and the Roman Church. Let's take a look at what happens in the next few decades after Gregory the Great's great papacy. This is a challenging time for the popes of Rome, the Roman Latin Church in general, and the entire Western world. I hope you enjoy, and I will see you next time. Today we're going to take a quick look at the popes right after the papacy of Gregory the Great. We recall the papacy of Gregory the Great is generally marked as the point where the city of Rome and the Roman Church hit their low point in all of the important areas of power and any sorts of needs, name it finance, politics, influence, culture, and any other metric you can think of. Gregory began the process of reversing the backward slide of Rome and the Roman Church. Let's take a look at what happened in the next few decades in the history of the papacy and the Western Church after the death of Gregory. This is a challenging time for the popes of Rome, the Church in general, and the entire Western world. Let's do a quick roundup of each of the popes of an approximately 20-year period from 604 to 625. Then we'll take a look at some of the big themes of the post-Gregory period. Now, the first pope we'll talk about is Sabinian, who reigned from September 604 to approximately February of 606. He was the nuncio or apocrisiarius to Constantinople under Gregory. He was well liked by Gregory, but not after Sabinian did not hit back hard enough against the emperor and patriarch of Constantinople for using the term ecumenical patriarch while he was nuncio there. There was a long wait before he got his official mandate from Constantinople after being elected pope. And he became a part of the pushback against the Gregorian policies of really pushing monasticism over other aspects of the church. After Sabinian, there was Boniface III, who was from February 607 to November 607, and he was another nuncio to Constantinople. He had very good relations with the Emperor Phocas, and maybe that's why Phocas continued to be popular in the West, even after he became extremely unpopular in the East. It took almost a year after the death of Sabinian for Boniface III to be consecrated. The assumption is there's some sort of shenanigans during his election. Major conflicts between camps in favor and against Gregory the Great's policies began to form, especially Gregory's pro-monastic policies. That's why it took so long. There's no evidence of the usual delay in imperial mandate for the Pope to be consecrated in this situation. Boniface held a synod to reform papal elections, probably because of his own difficult election. There'd be no more canvassing, electioneering, etc. until the previous pope was dead for 3 days. Now, canvassing, electioneering, and especially before a conclave is completely forbidden all the way to this day. It's really the conclave where these things are supposed to happen. Now, Boniface III was not against calling on imperial power in religious matters. He used the Exarch of Ravenna to go after holdouts in the Schism of the Three Chapters controversy, and he used strong-arm tactics when necessary to bring ecclesiastical enemies into line. Right after Boniface III, we have Boniface IV, who reigned a pretty decent length reign from September 608 to May of 615. That's pretty long reign for these days, especially. There's more famine, more plagues hit Rome. He was more in the pro-Gregory, pro-monastic camp, and he got involved in the affairs of the growing church in England. That's a theme we'll see coming up time and time again. Then we have Deus Dedit, who reigned from October 615 to November 618. Another pope of the anti-Gregory reaction, especially to Gregory's pro-monastic policies. In this long period after Gregory, this is the first time that regular priests were ordained since the time of Gregory. Not much is recorded about Deodidit's papacy. He was very pro-Byzantine, and he backed each of the exarchs of Ravenna. This was a serious time of rebellion amongst the Byzantines in Italy, and he supported the Emperor Heraclius, who we'll get into much more in a few minutes. Then we had Boniface III, we had Boniface IV, now we have Boniface V, who reigned from December 619 to October 625. It took 13 months after his election to get the official mandate from Constantinople. Now, there's some good reasons for that. The Emperor Heraclius was hip deep in the enormous wars with the Persians. These Persian wars had long-term political, economic, and religious effects. It took so long to get his mandate from Constantinople, the power of imperial sanction to ordain popes was delegated to the Exarch of Ravenna, who was much closer. So that's a big power shift from Constantinople back to Italy. And he's another pope in this anti-Gregory camp. Maybe not so much anti-Gregory, but anti-Gregorian policies. I have to imagine Gregory was still very popular as a religious figure, but his policies were definitely had gone to an extreme in the one direction. He gave many rights to priests, often at the expense of the monks. Another pope who was closely involved in the English church. And this is important because the papacy in the Western church started to spread its wings throughout Western Europe. and are taking on a more active role in events outside of Italy. So why are we looking at this small slice of papal history? The way we left things off with Gregory the Great's a big part of that. I mean, this is really the great man theory. I mean, he's Gregory the Great. Gregory changed everything, and he was great. That is the standard telling, and it's a very top-down telling. Standard histories don't have much to say about the papacy or the Latin church, really, up until the time of about Constantine, or Charlemagne, rather, which is coming up soon. If we leave things that way, then we forget that there was a significant reaction against Gregory's reforms. We kind of forget about all that, and it doesn't give us a full picture. Gregory was a monastic, and he favored monasticism. Maybe this was his plan, but maybe it was just his natural inclination, what he thought would work in a really difficult time. Most of the church, the people, the clergy, and the episcopacy were not monastics in the way Gregory was. Extreme asceticism, prayer, really ignoring the affairs of the world. The clergy, the episcopacy, they didn't necessarily want the entire church to be focused on monasticism, though. Monastics were not tied to the regular peasant or noble's needs. The papacy went back and forth between pro-Gregorian and these pro-monastic party and the pro-clergy party. The people also needed practical day-to-day pastoral care, which was not the top priority of monastics. Secular politics were not much in play because the Byzantines were the only game in town in Rome at this point. Rome was just one part of the machinations of politics of Constantinople and the Eastern Roman Empire. The Eastern Roman Byzantine Empire had serious problems. There was inner dissension, constant fighting and civil war. I highly suggest you listen to Robin Pearson's History of Byzantium podcast. He really details the importance of this era, and I also suggest you listen to the Byzantine Philosophy series of the History of Philosophy podcast by Peter Adamson, because both of these podcasts will give you a full 360-degree view of what was going on in the Mediterranean world during this time period. Now, really shortly, this 25 years or so is the time of the rise of the Emperor Heraclius. The empire was just in total chaos because of the war with the Sasanian Persians. As I said, listen to the History of Byzantium podcast for really the fascinating details, but here is the short story. The Persians just ripped through the Eastern Roman Empire. They took Jerusalem. They defiled the churches. They stole sacred relics such as the True Cross and just generally tore up the whole of the Roman Middle East. Not just Jerusalem. We're talking about Antioch, Damascus, you name it. The Persians took Egypt and the major ports like Alexandria, thereby devastating the food needs of Constantinople. The Persians came all the way to Chalcedon, right across the Bosphorus from Constantinople. They just wrecked the place. And meanwhile, while all that's happening, another group, the barbarian Avars and the Bulgarians, attacked Constantinople from the European side. These weren't the Bulgarians of today. They were steppe nomads of a Turkic branch, not the Slav Bulgarians they would eventually evolve into. Now, that's a whole different issue, and there is a podcast about that as well, the history of Bulgaria, that you should really listen to. I'm also friends with a lot of Bulgarians, so I don't want to offend them and get into their history and get anything wrong. So I'll just leave it at that. You have Avars and Bulgarians on one side, and then the Persians on the other side, of both laying Constantinople to siege. However, so you can see Heraclius had to deal with bigger fish of what was going on in the east with the Persians, more so than these minor issues that were going on in Italy at this point. the Patriarch of Constantinople during the siege, he paraded around an icon of the Theotokos, the Virgin Mary, and that's what's said to have beaten back the Avars, or at least that's how the story went. But this is getting slightly past our 625 time period, so let's just pause with that and keep that in mind. The rest of the story is that Heraclius shortly afterwards completely turned things around and turned all of the gains into Roman Persian territory, took all them back, and then he just ripped through Persian territory and eventually laid their capital to siege. In my estimation, this is one of the biggest turnarounds in the history of the world. The Emperor Phocas was on the ropes. He didn't exactly tag out to Heraclius as Heraclius took over in a coup, but you get the drift. Phocas went out, Heraclius came in and just completely turned the situation around. I mean, what we're looking at is what really could have been the end of the Roman Empire right at this point. Heraclius 100% reversed the war. He pushed the Persians back into their own end zone, if you'll allow me to mix my metaphors. The Byzantines were pushed back to all the way back to the walls of Constantinople, and within a very short amount of time, they were beating the Persians back to their own capital. The Persians had to give in to the Byzantine peace terms completely. So could we just leave things right there? Wouldn't that be the perfect ending? If you were writing the novel, that would be the storybook ending. It's the literary narrative arc to a T, except there was much more going on. This isn't the conclusion of the story by a long shot. And real life obviously doesn't end with a happily ever after. This is really just the beginning of the story. But we'll leave that for later episodes. The major theme of these popes from about the early 600s to about the first third of the 600 is that each dealt with the situation in Byzantium. Byzantium was the umbrella that was, or the dark cloud, you might even say, that was always hanging over the papacy. Now, each of these popes directly dealt with situations happening in England. Remember, Gregory the Great had a big push for Christianization of England. That's at least the very top-down narrative. What we can't forget is there were native Romano-British Celts who were still Christians and still living in the British Isles. They had an impact of some sort. It might have not have been that they were kings or that they were nobles, but they were in there, and they were definitely a part of the substrate of the English culture. English kings and rulers also had a big incentive to Christianize in order to plug into the wider political and economic world. The Franks were big-time Christians, and we'll see later on with other groups like the Vikings, it was easier to become a Christian in order to solidify trade, solidify marriages, especially amongst the aristocracy. It just made life a whole lot easier. There were other conversion movements going on. You had the Irish coming in from the West who were Christianized outside of the Roman Empire. We'll probably be doing a short episode about, or even maybe a series of episodes about the Christianization of Ireland, which is absolutely one of the most fascinating stories of Western Christianity at this time. There were also, more than likely, missionaries coming in from the continent that weren't directly tied to the Gregory the Great evangelization or missionary work that was happening in the early 600s, late 500s. Go back and refer to episodes 80 and 81 that I did with Professor James Early for the more detail. There's a lot of interesting things going on there. Many of the popes we discuss today interacted directly with church organization and practice in the English church. In parts of Italy, the popes had very little control over affairs, but in England, the popes were solidifying their power. The English church would be the bulwark of Western Latin Catholicism and one of the best allies of the popes all the way up until the Reformation. Really up until like the very beginning of the Reformation, and even beyond that, they were defenders of the faith. Different relationships and institutions were starting to be put in place that would eventually lead to a unified and united Latin-based Roman Catholicism in the West. Think of the idea of Christendom. The idea of Christendom as an institution and state of mind dominated Western Europe for centuries. I mean, really, almost up until this day. The popes were not the grand monarchs that they would become, but were laying the foundation of that. The papacy still had the problem of the schism of the three chapters in northern Italy. They were not solidified by any stretch of the imagination. There's even an interesting story of an Irish monk named Columbanus who was living in Italy at the time. He wrote a letter to Boniface IV on the behalf of the Lombard king. Columbanus called himself all sorts of deprecatory names and heaps one laudatory title after another onto the Pope. The letter was incredibly respectful and rude at the same time. Columbanus took Boniface to task for condemning the three chapters. He calls Boniface a heretic for not having problems with the Fifth Ecumenical Council. He almost dares the Pope to hold a synod to restore his own orthodoxy. Surprisingly, nothing actually came of this letter. The popes didn't change their mind, but surprisingly, despite the strong and even disrespectful tone of the letter, nothing happened to Columbanus either. He's one of the most revered saints of all time, and really all the way up until today. I'll probably have to take a closer look at Columbanus' interesting life and travels as we continue to explore the history of the church, because he was one of these few people who did bop around through Europe. Maybe not travels as extensively as somebody a few hundred years earlier, but really big moves for the time. There's a few issues brewing in the East. These issues initially didn't affect the papacy in the West at this first quarter of the 7th century time period, but the issues in the East will be front and center in the West very, very soon. We'll just introduce them today, and they're really the issues in the controversy over monotheletism and monoenergism. And these are two imperially sanctioned policies on how to square monophysitism with Chalcedonianism. This is similar to the top-down approach of the Henoticon of Zeno from about 100 years earlier. The Henoticon basically said, don't talk about any of these tricky theological issues. And this was really the strategy to make everyone happy, Monophysites and Chalcedonians alike. As long as we don't talk about it, it's not an issue. Let's just sweep everything under the rug and there won't be any problems, right? Well, the Henoticon didn't work, and we'll have to see in upcoming episodes if monotheletism and or monoenergism will work. Now, Heraclius was supposedly the one who came up with this theology all by himself after debating with an Armenian Monophysite bishop during his campaigns in the East. We'll see if that has a kernel of truth in it as well. As we all know, the relations with the Monophysites were always rocky at best. Monophysites in the Middle East and Egypt were very nearly, really you could say they were happy that the Persians came and kicked the Byzantines out. They were never very much interested in compromising with the Chalcedonians because they always felt that they were in the theological driver's seat. Rome and the Western Latin Church never had much interest in compromising either. At least not so much as we will see. The Byzantine emperors in the court were the ones who were always interested in compromises, especially forced compromises. They desperately needed unity in the empire to keep external enemies and really internal enemies at bay. The other issue going on at this time was there was a little new movement percolating just outside of the Roman Empire, and that's a thing called Islam. The first quarter of the 7th century was the very earliest beginnings of Islam. But there were some factors that were building up in the time before that allowed the Arab armies to rise up. That's really the real and the interesting story of Islam at its earliest time. It was a movement of unification of various Arab tribes under one guiding philosophy of pan-Arabism. They were starting to look at each other as not separate tribes, and the historical Muhammad is really his key thing was that he found a way to bring all these different tribes together under one goal. I mean, we all know this. Movements in history just, or even world history, just don't come out of nowhere. There's always many interesting factors that are behind them. And that's what we do in this podcast. We look at interesting factors and discuss them. That's what I love to do. And that's what our whole trip is about. Now, to wrap things up, even though traditionally speaking, Gregory the Great's papacy in time marks the rock bottom for the Western Europe and Western European Church in the Dark Ages, it didn't mean everything changed overnight. There were still problems. Gregory and his reforms, particularly his reforms of monasticism, cast long shadows. There were counter-reactions amongst the clergy and the episcopate to the favoring of monastic communities. The Byzantine Empire still had strong control over the papacy and the operation of the papacy. Now that Byzantine power decreased as the years went by, but at this point in the early 7th century, it's still pretty strong. The papacy started to have a centralizing influence. That's another thing that's going on. Local churches, England, Gaul, Spain, listen to the papacy, but there's still some holdouts, such as the 3 chapter schism areas. Of course, there is much more to come, and I hope to talk to you soon about all of these exciting developments in church and papal history and just much more. I always appreciate you listening. You are what makes this podcast work, and I look forward to talking to you next time.